February 1943. In the jagged mountains of western Tunisia, a young American army was about to collide with one of the most experienced fighting forces on Earth. The narrow corridor, known as the Battle of Kasserine Pass, would become the place where illusions died. Only 3 months earlier, American troops had landed in North Africa under Operation Torch. Many of the men now digging foxholes in the cold Tunisian hills had never heard a shot fired in combat. Their officers had studied war in classrooms and field exercises, not on blood-soaked battlefields. Their tanks were mechanically impressive, their uniforms crisp, their supply lines vast. On paper, the United States Army looked powerful. Across the mountains stood something very different. Veterans of the Africa Corps, survivors of the Eastern Front, soldiers who had fought the British for years in the desert and had learned maneuver warfare the hard way. At their head was Erwin Rommel, a commander whose name alone carried psychological weight. Rommel understood speed, shock, and the ruthless exploitation of weakness. And in February 1943, he saw weakness everywhere. The American defensive lines were thin and poorly coordinated. Units were spread too far apart. Command structures were confused. Some American positions were placed forward in exposed terrain, separated by miles of broken ground that made mutual support nearly impossible. Communication between infantry, armor, and artillery was inconsistent. Radios malfunctioned. Orders were delayed. Reports contradicted each other. On February 19th, German forces struck. Panzer units pushed through mountain passes with terrifying precision. They bypassed strong points, cut supply roads, and attacked from unexpected directions. American troops who believed they were holding secure positions suddenly found German tanks behind them. Entire battalions were forced into chaotic withdrawals. Some units fought stubbornly, others disintegrated under pressure they had never experienced before. German after-action accounts described American resistance as brave but disorganized. Individual soldiers fought hard, small groups held ground longer than expected, but operational cohesion was missing. There was no fluid response, no elastic defense. German commanders, trained in Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, adapted instantly to changing conditions. American officers often waited for explicit orders. Within 6 days, more than 6,500 American casualties mounted, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Hundreds of vehicles were lost. Large quantities of equipment fell into German hands. The mountain passes echoed with retreat. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed confirmation of their assumptions. The Americans were wealthy, they were enthusiastic, but they were inexperienced. Some German officers reportedly dismissed them as soldiers of goodwill but little skill. Compared to the British Eighth Army, which had at least years of desert combat behind it, the Americans appeared green. But beneath the surface of humiliation, something else was taking shape. German troops began to notice peculiar characteristics. American artillery, when properly coordinated, was heavier and more plentiful than expected. Even during confused retreats, shells landed with unsettling frequency. Supply dumps, once destroyed, were quickly replaced. Captured American soldiers spoke openly about factories back home, producing unimaginable quantities of weapons, trucks, tanks, ammunition. There seemed to be no end to it. The United States was not fighting with the desperation of a nation under siege. It was fighting with the depth of an industrial giant just beginning to mobilize. More importantly, the American High Command reacted fast. Within weeks, ineffective commanders were relieved. Leadership changes rippled through the ranks. Training intensified. Coordination between air power, artillery, and ground forces was re-examined with urgency. The defeat at Kasserine was not buried, it was dissected. Reports were written, failures were analyzed without romanticism. The Germans did not yet realize it, but they had delivered something dangerous to their enemy, a concentrated lesson. Unlike European armies exhausted by years of attrition, the United States Army of 1943 had room to improve. It possessed manpower reserves untouched by previous campaigns. It had industrial capacity unmatched by any Axis power. And it had an institutional culture increasingly willing to adapt rather than cling to pride. Rommel himself exploited American weaknesses skillfully during the battle, but even he understood something fundamental about war. Today's amateur can become tomorrow's threat if given time. And time, ironically, was not on Germany's side. The fighting at Kasserine Pass ended not with annihilation, but with withdrawal and reorganization. American forces stabilized their lines, reinforcements arrived, air support improved, artillery coordination sharpened. What had begun as a collapse slowly transformed into controlled resistance. For the American soldier who survived those February days, the experience was brutal and unforgettable. They had seen German armor break through positions that had seemed secure. They had watched units scatter under coordinated assault. They had felt the shock of modern mechanized warfare delivered by experts. But they had learned. They learned that bravery without coordination was not enough. They learned that modern war required integration, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power functioning as one organism. They learned that overconfidence could be fatal. And, perhaps most importantly, they learned that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, merely experienced. The myth of American incompetence was born at Kasserine, but so was something far more consequential, the determination to erase it. German commanders left the battlefield believing they had measured the Americans and found them lacking. What they did not understand was that they had encountered the United States Army at its lowest point, before reform, before doctrinal evolution, before the full machinery of American war production had reached maturity. Kasserine Pass was a defeat. It was chaotic, costly, and humiliating. But it was also the last time German forces would underestimate American infantry on such a scale. In the mountains of Tunisia, amid retreat and confusion, the foundation was laid for a transformation that would reshape the war in Europe. Spring 1943. The dust of defeat had barely settled in Tunisia when the United States Army began to change itself with a speed that surprised even its allies. The humiliation at the Battle of Kasserine Pass was not buried under excuses. It was treated as evidence. Reports flooded headquarters. Field commanders wrote blunt assessments. Units that had broken under pressure were reorganized. Officers who hesitated were replaced. The U.S. Army did something rare in wartime. It admitted it had been outmatched and moved immediately to fix it. One of the most visible symbols of that shift was the rise of aggressive leadership under commanders like George S. Patton. When Patton assumed command of two corps, discipline tightened overnight. Uniform standards were enforced. Defensive positions were strengthened. Training intensified. Movement became sharper, faster, more deliberate. But the transformation ran deeper than personality. American planners began studying German tactics systematically. They analyzed how panzer units bypassed strong points instead of attacking them directly. They examined the flexibility of German small unit leadership. They observed how quickly German artillery responded to battlefield developments. These were not abstract lessons. They were incorporated into daily drills. Coordination became the obsession. Infantry no longer operated in isolation from armor. Tanks were not sent forward blindly without reconnaissance. Artillery officers were embedded closer to frontline units. Air support was integrated more deliberately, with forward observers improving communication between ground forces and aircraft. Within weeks, the same army that had fractured in the mountains began to display cohesion. The first real test of this reformed force came in March 1943 at the Battle of El Guitar. German commanders, confident after Kasserine, launched another offensive. This time, however, they encountered something different. American forces had prepared defensive belts supported by carefully positioned artillery. Anti-tank guns were dug in with overlapping fields of fire. Forward observers were ready. Communication lines were reinforced. When German armor advanced, they did not find scattered resistance, they found layered defense. As panzer formations pushed forward, American artillery opened up with intensity and coordination that startled even seasoned German officers. Shells landed not sporadically, but in calculated concentration. Units attempting flanking maneuvers were met with rapid response. Air support joined in, striking armored columns exposed on open terrain. The battle was still brutal. German units were experienced, disciplined, and dangerous, but the Americans held. More than that, they counterattacked. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. At Kasserine, American troops had reacted to German initiative. At El Guitar, they anticipated it. German accounts from Tunisia begin to change tone during this period. While still critical of American tactical inexperience at lower levels, officers noted the increasing weight of American firepower and the growing coordination between branches. The phrase material superiority appears more often, not as mockery, but as warning. Because what the Germans began to realize was this: American mistakes were not being repeated. Unlike many European armies hardened by years of static doctrine, the U.S. Army was still fluid. It had not yet calcified. Its leadership structure allowed for removal and replacement at speed. It had access to enormous training infrastructure back home. New divisions arriving in North Africa were already benefiting from lessons learned weeks earlier. This capacity for rapid institutional learning was something Germany itself had demonstrated early in the war. Now the Americans were showing a similar adaptability, but backed by unmatched industrial depth. Equipment losses that would cripple other nations were replenished almost immediately. New radios improved communication. Additional artillery pieces arrived in theater. Fresh troops rotated in. Logistical chains stretched across the Atlantic functioned with increasing efficiency, and morale began to shift. American soldiers who had survived Kasserine carried hard-earned experience. They were no longer completely green. They had seen German tactics up close. They understood the speed of a panzer thrust, the precision of German combined arms, the importance of digging in properly and maintaining communication. They were no longer shocked by it. German intelligence officers, observing from the other side, noticed another unsettling pattern. American units did not collapse the same way twice. Where breakthroughs had once caused panic, they now triggered coordinated fallback positions. Where artillery had once been slow to respond, it now reacted with alarming speed. The learning curve was steep, and it was visible. By late spring 1943, Axis forces in North Africa were under mounting pressure. The strategic situation was deteriorating for Germany and Italy. But beyond the operational setbacks, something else had shifted: the perception of the American soldier. No longer merely enthusiastic amateurs, they were becoming methodical and increasingly dangerous. Rommel himself would soon depart the North African theater, but the German officers who remained had begun to reassess. The Americans were not yet at the level of the Wehrmacht-Veteran formations. They still made mistakes. They still lacked the battlefield intuition forged through years of war, but they were improving, fast. And, unlike Germany, whose divisions were being drained on multiple fronts, the United States was only beginning to deploy its full strength. The desert battles of Tunisia were not decisive in isolation, but they marked a turning point in something less visible and perhaps more important:
momentum of competence. In a matter of months, the U.S. Army had moved from shock and fragmentation to structured resilience. It had replaced commanders, revised tactics, tightened discipline, improved coordination, and demonstrated that defeat would not define it. At El Guitar, the Germans encountered not the same army they had routed at Kasserine, but a force that had absorbed the lesson and returned fire with precision. The transformation was not complete. Greater tests lay ahead, in Sicily, in Italy, and eventually in Western Europe. But the pattern had been established. The Americans would study, they would adapt, and they would not remain amateurs for long.
By 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had learned something unsettling. If you moved under British artillery, you feared accuracy. If you moved under Soviet artillery, you feared volume. But if you moved under American artillery, you feared time itself. Somewhere behind the American front lines, often miles from the guns, a quiet revolution was unfolding. It did not rely on heroic charges or dramatic breakthroughs. It relied on mathematics, radios, discipline, and a system so efficient that German officers would later describe it as unlike anything they had encountered before. At the heart of this transformation was the Fire Directions Center, a concept refined at Fort Sill and deployed across U.S. divisions in Europe. Instead of each artillery battery calculating its own firing data independently, American units centralized the process. Observers at the front relayed target coordinates. Within minutes, sometimes seconds, multiple batteries, even from different battalions, could concentrate fire on a single point. To a German platoon advancing through a hedgerow or forest, it felt almost supernatural. The shells did not arrive gradually, they arrived all at once. The technique that most disturbed German survivors had a simple name: time on target. Instead of firing rounds in sequence, American gunners calculated trajectories so that shells from multiple positions would land simultaneously. There was no warning adjustment shot, no ranging round. The first sound German soldiers often heard was the whistling descent of dozens of shells converging at the same instant. Interrogation records after the war repeatedly emphasized this shock. German officers spoke of American artillery as extraordinarily flexible and alarmingly responsive. Units attempting to regroup or counterattack often found themselves caught under sudden, perfectly timed barrages that shattered cohesion before momentum could build. This was not accidental firepower, it was systematized destruction. Unlike many European armies, where artillery was sometimes allocated rigidly to specific formations, American doctrine allowed rapid massing of guns across divisional boundaries. A frontline observer could trigger not just his own battery, but dozens of guns within range. Fire could shift quickly from one target to another. Defensive barrages could transform into offensive preparation within minutes. And the Americans had ammunition in abundance. By 1944, U.S. industrial production was delivering artillery shells at a scale Germany could not match. While German batteries increasingly rationed ammunition, American units often fired generously, confident that resupply would follow. Logistics became a weapon in itself. But the system required more than shells. It required training. Forward observers were taught to operate under fire, maintaining communication even as positions shifted. Radio networks were expanded and standardized. Calculations were drilled until they became instinctive. Redundancy was built into the system. If one line failed, another carried the message. The result was an artillery arm that functioned less like scattered units and more like a single organism. During the Normandy campaign, German defenders in the bocage faced not only determined infantry, but an invisible hammer waiting behind them. Attempts to assemble counterattacks were frequently broken up before they could fully form. Tanks moving through narrow lanes became targets for coordinated barrages.
Road junctions turned into death traps once identified by American observers. The psychological effect was profound. German veterans had learned to endure bombardment. On the Eastern Front, they had survived immense Soviet barrages. In North Africa, they had endured British shelling. But American fire had a different character, less predictable, more synchronized, often sudden. There were no long preliminary warnings, just impact. Even elite formations found it difficult to maneuver freely under such conditions. Movement during daylight became increasingly risky. Concentrations of armor had to disperse quickly to avoid detection. Defensive positions required deeper entrenchment and camouflage. German doctrine prized initiative and rapid counterstroke, but initiative becomes dangerous when every movement can trigger immediate, concentrated artillery response. And artillery was only one layer. American forces increasingly integrated air power with ground operations. Fighter bombers roamed behind the front, attacking supply lines and armored reserves. When artillery pinned German units in place, aircraft could strike exposed targets. The coordination was not always perfect, war rarely is, but it improved steadily. The combined effect was cumulative. German officers began distinguishing between Allied opponents. British forces were often seen as methodical and deliberate. Soviet forces were relentless and overwhelming. But American forces were described in terms of firepower, mobility, and logistical depth. In captured documents and post-war studies, one theme appears repeatedly. The Americans could bring down massive fire quickly and sustain it, and they could replace losses. A German division battered by artillery might struggle for weeks to rebuild. An American division, though suffering casualties, could draw on replacement systems that kept it operational. Equipment damaged one week was often repaired or replaced the next. Guns destroyed were substituted, ammunition stocks replenished. This resilience reinforced the psychological impact of artillery dominance. Destroying an American position did not guarantee its disappearance. It might return, reinforced. By mid-1944, German troops no longer underestimated American infantry. They had learned that wherever American riflemen appeared, artillery was never far behind. A patrol sighted at dawn to trigger a barrage by mid-morning. A suspected assembly area could become a crater field within minutes. The battlefield itself seemed to belong to the guns. For German commanders planning defensive operations in France, this reality forced adjustments. Counterattacks had to be swift and limited. Prolonged assembly increased risk. Movement required concealment and speed. Static defense invited bombardment. The Americans had turned coordination into combat power. What began in Tunisia as a weakness, poor integration between branches, had evolved into one of the U.S. Army's greatest strengths. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support increasingly functioned as interlocking components rather than isolated elements. The lesson of Kasserine had matured into doctrine. By the time Allied forces prepared for the breakout from Normandy, German planners no longer saw American troops as inexperienced amateurs. They saw an opponent capable of concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points, supported by artillery that responded with mathematical precision. Fear in war rarely comes from bravado. It comes from predictability. When you know what your enemy can do, and you know you cannot easily stop it. For many German soldiers in 1944, the sound of incoming American shells arriving all at once without warning became the sound of that realization. The Americans had not merely improved, they had engineered a battlefield advantage that was systematic, scalable, and relentless. And the Wehrmacht was beginning to feel it everywhere.
June 1944. When Allied troops landed in Normandy, German commanders did not panic at the sight of American infantry coming ashore. They expected a difficult fight,
but not an extraordinary one. The Atlantic Wall had been breached before in theory, and the Wehrmacht still believed its defensive skill, terrain familiarity, and operational experience could contain the invasion. What they did not anticipate was how quickly the American army would adapt again. The Normandy countryside was unlike North Africa. There were no vast deserts, no open maneuver corridors. Instead, there was the bocage, a labyrinth of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and thick earthen embankments dividing small fields into natural fortresses. Each hedgerow was a defensive wall, each field a potential killing zone. For weeks after D-Day, American units struggled to advance more than a few hundred yards at a time. German defenders, often from experienced formations, used the terrain expertly. Machine guns were concealed behind thick vegetation. Mortars were pre-registered. Snipers operated from hidden positions. Tanks could not easily push through the dense hedgerows without exposing their vulnerable undersides. Progress was slow. Casualties mounted. But something familiar was happening beneath the surface: analysis, adaptation, refinement. American soldiers began improvising field modifications to their Sherman tanks, welding steel prongs onto the front to cut through hedgerows rather than climb over them. Infantry tactics shifted. Instead of frontal rushes across open fields, units coordinated tighter artillery preparation, flanking maneuvers, and close air support. Engineers were pushed forward to clear lanes. Communication between small units improved under fire. The learning curve, once again, was steep. German commanders observing the front began to notice that American assaults, though costly, were becoming more coordinated. Artillery would isolate a hedgerow position before infantry moved. Smoke screens obscured advances. Fighter bombers struck crossroads behind the lines, complicating reinforcement efforts. The Americans were not simply pushing forward, they were dismantling the defensive system piece by piece. Then came the decisive moment, Operation Cobra. By late July 1944, Allied forces had secured a lodgment in Normandy, but the front remained congested. German units, though strained, still held cohesive defensive lines. To break the stalemate, American planners prepared a concentrated assault west of St. Lo. The opening blow was unprecedented in scale for the Western Front. Heavy bombers saturated a narrow corridor of German defenses. Though the bombardment was not perfectly executed and tragically caused some American casualties, its psychological and physical effect on German positions was devastating. Defensive cohesion fractured. Communications were disrupted. Units already worn down by weeks of combat were suddenly overwhelmed. Then the ground assault began. American armored and infantry divisions surged through the weakened sector with speed that German commanders had not seen from them before. Instead of methodical hedgerow fighting, the battle transformed into maneuver warfare, the very style at which Germany had excelled earlier in the war. Only now, the Americans were executing it with superior resources. German attempts to organize counterattacks encountered the now familiar obstacle: rapid, concentrated artillery and air power. Columns assembling for response were struck from above or shelled before momentum could build. Fuel shortages worsened the crisis. Replacement units were scarce. The Luftwaffe was largely absent from the skies. Within days, what had been a defensive struggle became a collapse. American forces broke into open country, accelerating toward Brittany and the Seine. German formations that had expected to contain the invasion now faced encirclement. The operational tempo shifted dramatically. Instead of reacting to German movements, American commanders dictated them. This was not the army that had stumbled at Kasserine. It was faster, more integrated, more confident. German officers began drawing sharper distinctions between their Allied opponents. British forces were often viewed as deliberate and cautious in operational tempo, but American forces, once unleashed into open terrain, moved with aggressive momentum, supported by trucks, fuel, and supply columns that seemed endless. Mobility became a weapon. American divisions could advance rapidly without immediately outrunning their logistics. Bridges were repaired quickly. Engineers cleared obstacles efficiently. Fuel and ammunition convoys rolled forward day and night. Where German units increasingly worried about shortages, American units focused on speed. The breakout from Normandy triggered one of the most dramatic operational reversals of the war in the West. German divisions that had fought skillfully in the bocage now retreated under pressure they could not stabilize. Attempts to form defensive lines were undermined by constant Allied air reconnaissance and artillery harassment. German commanders understood maneuver warfare. They had perfected it in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. But now they faced an opponent applying similar principles with greater industrial depth and growing tactical sophistication. The American infantryman of summer 1944 was not inexperienced. He had crossed beaches under fire, fought through hedgerows, coordinated with tanks and aircraft, survived artillery duels. He moved with the awareness that behind him stood a logistical machine capable of sustaining relentless advance. The psychological balance shifted. Where early encounters had led Germans to underestimate American tactical skill, Normandy forced reassessment. Reports increasingly acknowledged the scale of American material superiority and the effectiveness of combined arms coordination. More importantly, they recognized the speed at which American forces could exploit a breakthrough. Once the line cracked, the flood followed. Operation Cobra did not end the war. Fierce fighting continued across France and into Germany itself. But it marked the moment when German planners could no longer view American forces as merely learning participants in the European theater. They were now operationally dominant in the West. The mountains of Tunisia had exposed American weakness. The fields of Normandy revealed American adaptation. And the breakout demonstrated something even more significant. The United States Army had mastered not only survival, but momentum. From that point forward, German strategy in the West would increasingly revolve around delay, defense, and desperate counterstroke. Because the Americans were no longer reacting. They were driving the war forward.
December 1944. Snow fell over the forests of the Ardennes, muting sound and masking movement. For months, the German army in the West had been retreating, battered by constant pressure, short on fuel, short on reserves, short on air cover. But now, in a final gamble, Hitler ordered a massive counteroffensive designed to split the Allied front and seize Antwerp. The attack would fall heavily on American forces. It began before dawn on December 16. Artillery thundered across the frozen landscape as German infantry and armor surged forward under cover of fog and surprise. Entire American units were caught off guard. Communication lines were cut. Road junctions were seized. Some positions collapsed under the weight of the assault. The offensive would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. For German commanders, this was more than a battlefield operation. It was a test. If American forces could be shocked into disarray, as they had been at Kasserine nearly 2 years earlier, perhaps the Western Front could still be destabilized. In the first hours, the attack achieved tactical surprise. Several inexperienced American divisions in quiet sectors were overwhelmed. Prisoners were taken, supply depots captured, columns disrupted. The front line bent dramatically, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. But something crucial did not happen. It did not break.
In sector after sector, small American units formed improvised defensive pockets. Roadblocks appeared at key intersections. Engineers blew bridges at the last possible moment. Artillery units, often firing over open sights, held positions until overrun. Communications were restored under fire. At places like Bastogne, surrounded American forces refused surrender demands. When a German delegation delivered an ultimatum to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, his reply was a single word: nuts. The defiance was not theatrical bravado. It reflected a hardened force that had learned resilience. German armored columns pushing westward quickly encountered the familiar problem that had plagued them since Normandy: concentrated American artillery and air power. Even in poor weather, artillery coordination remained lethal. As skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned in force, striking exposed German supply lines and congested roads. Fuel shortages worsened the German predicament. Panzers advanced only as far as their dwindling reserves allowed. Meanwhile, American logistical networks, though strained, continued feeding reinforcements into the battle. Divisions were shifted rapidly from quieter sectors. Units that had fought in France were rushed north. The response was not chaotic, it was structured. Within days, a defensive web began to tighten around the German spearheads. German officers later described their frustration. Initial gains had relied on shock and surprise, but once American command structures stabilized, countermeasures came quickly and with increasing coordination. Artillery concentrations broke up attacks. Defensive strongpoints slowed momentum. Counterattacks sealed off penetrations. The Americans absorbed the blow and then pushed back. What made the difference was not just numbers, it was integration. Infantry, artillery, armor, and engineers functioned together even under extreme conditions. Frozen roads complicated movement but did not paralyze it. Communications faltered, but redundancy prevented collapse. When German units attempted to exploit gaps, they encountered rapid response rather than confusion. The soldiers holding the line in the Ardennes were not untested men of Tunisia. Many were veterans of Normandy and the breakout across France. They understood German tactics. They recognized feints. They knew the importance of buying time. And time, once again, worked against Germany. As the offensive stalled, American forces transitioned from defense to counterattack. The bulge narrowed. Encircled units were relieved. German formations, depleted and undersupplied, withdrew. The cost was enormous. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. Winter conditions intensified suffering, but strategically, the German gamble failed. More importantly, it shattered any lingering notion that American infantry could be decisively broken by shock alone. Post-war interrogation records from German officers reflect a sobering assessment. While early war perceptions had underestimated American tactical skill, late war evaluations acknowledged American firepower, logistical endurance, and adaptability. The ability of U.S. forces to reorganize under pressure, to mass artillery rapidly, and to sustain prolonged operations was repeatedly cited. Some German commanders drew distinctions between their Allied adversaries. British forces were respected for discipline and defensive strength, Soviet forces for sheer scale and aggression, but American forces were increasingly associated with mobility, firepower, and industrial depth. The Ardennes crystallized that reputation. Even in the face of surprise attack, even under winter conditions, American units did not disintegrate. They bent, reorganized, and responded with coordinated force. Artillery remained decisive. Air power returned as weather improved. Logistics, the quiet backbone of the American war effort, ensured that reinforcements and ammunition continued to flow. For German planners, the implications were stark. There would be no negotiated stalemate in the West, no decisive rupture that shattered Allied cohesion. The U.S. Army of late 1944 was not merely large, it was structurally resilient. The transformation from Kasserine to the Ardennes was complete. In Tunisia, German commanders had seen brave but inexperienced troops struggling against veteran formations. In the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, they confronted a force that combined experience, coordination, and overwhelming support. Fear in war is rarely dramatic. It emerges slowly, built from repeated encounters with an enemy who adapts faster than expected. By the winter of 1944, German soldiers had learned that attacking American positions meant facing immediate artillery response, that breakthroughs would be contested by reserves moving with remarkable speed, that supply shortages plagued one side of the line far more than the other. The final German offensive in the West did not end with triumph. It ended with exhaustion. And in its aftermath, the perception of American infantry had shifted irrevocably, from amateurs in the mountains of Tunisia to a force that even seasoned Wehrmacht veterans approached with caution. The war would continue into Germany itself, but the lesson had been learned. The Americans had not only caught up, they had become an opponent the German army could no longer afford to underestimate.